Okay, this meeting is being recorded.
Yes.
Okay. And we've got this sort of working hypothesis that we've had since we were founded, really, which is local civil society organizations and civil society represents the biggest single source of untapped peace building potential globally. And in our own way, I suppose, we've been trying to create a sort of movement of community-led peace builders. You know, our work is around strengthening the ecosystem of local peace builders to make sure that they play the role that they should be playing in peace and stability in their countries, and that all of the efforts around building sustainable peace should be centered around local people and local communities. So, as John said, we've been engaging with various stakeholders, including the Hunger Project and others, for years on this issue. So why did we produce this report? Well, first and foremost, we believe that the current system needs radical reform. I think most people understand. And when I talk about the system, I don't just mean the international peace building system. I'm talking about the peace building humanitarian development system, the sort of broader system in which all of this work takes place. And we see commonalities, I'm sure you do too, across the triple nexus around this focus on top-down, external and INGO efforts over local efforts. And despite all of our efforts to engage with governments, engage with policymakers, engage with think tanks and INGOs about how we need to shift and center these efforts around local people and local communities, we tend to get the same resistance. And we've had this for many years. We hear local actors can't be trusted. They lack capacity. I still hear the lack of capacity being a reason why there isn't a greater shift towards power and resources going to local communities and local organizations. I've heard policymakers still talk about local civil society not existing in a particular region, which is a fiction. I mean, I don't think there is any part of the world where we can say that civil society doesn't exist. Wherever there are people, there is civil society of some description. The risk of fraud or funds going into the wrong hands is a common refrain still that we all hear. I'm sure you've heard it yourselves. Local groups can't meet our strict compliance requirements. Local groups aren't effective. And these are only some of them. We've heard these excuses on and off for the past 20 years. And we've tried to address each of them through different lenses, through a lens of sustainability, through the lens of inclusion, effectiveness, trying to persuade donors that actually this work, and I'm sure you would say the same about your own work, community-led work is more sustainable, more effective, more cost-effective. All of those actually don't necessarily address the real problem, which is that a lot of the resistance is built upon overt and structural racist thinking. And we, as a sector, have not been brave enough to acknowledge that. It's a taboo subject. Frankly, it's been a taboo subject for many, many years, and those who have talked about it have been vilified. It's only very recently, I think in the last couple of years, where structural racism and the sort of colonial roots of international assistance has really started to be discussed. So we held a consultation last year. We held it with some other organizations, ADESO, the Alliance for Peace Building, and Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security. And immediately the question was, should this be focused on peace building? And a very strong response was, please don't silo this. Local practitioners, these silos are meaningless. Peace builder is the community activist, the person who does community development, mobilizer, the person who responds in terms of humanitarian response. So we decided to focus it on aid or the international system more broadly. And we have our own online platform, discussion platform, where we have been holding global consultations for a number of years now, and it's been very successful. It's sort of low bandwidth type discussion board, which really encourages conversations. We had about 158 people take part over 3 days, and a very rich discussion. And you can see the topics of the discussion first focused on language and terminology. What do we mean by structural racism? What do we mean by decolonization? We looked at the history of our sector, how it has been rooted in the colonial era, and what consequences of that are for work that we do now. We talked about the barriers and the challenges that practitioners face. And I should mention that the report does not include personal testimonies of how people have experienced racism, either structural racism or direct racism, because those were, very personal stories. But I want to emphasize that, there was a lot of very raw sort of insights around how this shows up in the work. And then we wanted to get into the actual recommendations themselves. How can we decolonize the system, and what are the practical next steps? And I should mention to you, this really wasn't an easy report to write. It wasn't an easy report to write for two reasons. First, it was 125 pages of transcripts. We had a big transcript of comment over the 3 days. So how to whittle that down into something that, the common thread. So that was the first thing. And the second thing is, Peace Direct isn't an expert in this. We care about this issue deeply, and we've been focused on locally led 20 years, almost 20 years now. But we wouldn't say that we're not holding ourselves up as the experts. We have a lot of work to do ourselves to get our own house in order. And so we also wanted to recognize that in doing this report. There's a lot, all of us have to do work, including Peace Direct. A lot more work needs to be done. So in terms of the key findings, first was the term itself. There was differences of opinion about how whether the term should be used. Some, for example, talked about decoloniality in Latin America being a much more relevant term. But actually, there was a general consensus that is a useful framing for this conversation. And so the definition that we were using, which is a sort of tried and tested, well-established definition, is the process of deconstructing and dismantling colonial era and neo-colonial ideologies regarding the superiority of Western thought and approaches. That's the working definition. In terms of the colonial roots, there was a very strong sense amongst the participants that the humanitarians and the development practitioners particularly, but also peace-building practitioners from INGOs and the policy space, really don't want to acknowledge the colonial roots of the work. But actually, what's happened over the years is that they've professionalized and therefore have become neutral actors in this space. And the participants overwhelmingly rejected that sense that there is they're working neutrally. They said that's a fiction. You're not neutral, and you're not. This is not ahistorical. There is a history that you're bringing to this, and we have to acknowledge that history. In terms of structural racism, there were plenty of stories about how this shows up, and we'll talk about some of that later. What was really striking was how deeply embedded it is in the everyday culture of the sector. And it even goes so far as to influence the way local staff of INGOs regard their own community. In a sense, local staff and local organizations drink the Kool-Aid. They start to become sort of the mini INGOs, often because they can see the success, the so-called success of INGOs in terms of bringing in money and resources and influence. So they start to play the system as well, and feeding into the same assumptions. So this isn't something that just affects white practitioners based in global north headquartered organizations. It actually influences all practitioners to some degree. Sector language was a very strong theme in this. There are so many terms that still reinforce the notion that local communities and local people lack agency. And there was a lot of sort of structurally racist thinking behind that and neo-colonial perception. So capacity building, use of the word beneficiaries, the use of the word aid itself. They were challenging us, the participants were challenging us to use different language and think much more intentionally about the language that we use, so that we don't, we really don't fall into those same traps. We talked about program research, program design and research design really being rooted in Western values and knowledge. So a sense that we don't value local knowledge, Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous wisdom and practice. And actually, if you look at how so much of in our world, in peace building, how much conflict analysis is developed by external organizations, and think tanks versus the sort of analysis that is generated locally. There's a huge disparity. So this sense that local knowledge is still not being given primacy, it's not centered around that knowledge. A few participants also talked about the fact that technical expertise from outsiders is prized more highly than contextual expertise. So they said, we are the contextual experts. We understand our context. Why is that not given as high a priority as technical expertise that we see that is imported from outside? In terms of intersectionality, practitioners described really feeling like second-class citizens in their own countries, which was pretty hard and pretty sobering to hear. And they gave plenty of examples of that. They said it's even worse if you hold multiple identities. So if you're a young person, or if you're a young woman, or if you're a young disabled woman, actually those multiple identities really mean that the sense of marginalization is even greater. And of course, COVID-19 was seen as an opportunity, even though it's been awful for the whole world, an opportunity possibly to reset the way in which we have relationships, local practitioners and local communities have with international actors. But there was also a concern that actually we might just spring back to the status quo ante, right? We might just spring back to NGOs and policymakers still having this very neo-colonial approach, which is still built on all these sort of structurally racist assumptions, and that we don't use COVID as an opportunity to really change the paradigm. In terms of how structural racism shows up, I'm just going to give you a couple of examples because we want to go on to the recommendations. I would encourage you to have a look at the report because this diagram, these are the main areas that came out of the consultation. There may well be more. I'll give you a couple of examples. One is around INGO strategies. If you look at most INGO strategies, they're predicated on the assumption that they should be there for the long haul and actually that they should continue to grow. Most INGO strategies talk about growth and expansion, expanding the footprint rather than reducing it. And it's based then on an assumption that there's a need for their expertise. So why is that? Why are we still having INGOs that are growing in influence and taking up more of the funding when actually there should be a shifting of power and resources to local communities and local actors? I talked about knowledge generation and analysis. So let me talk about relationships. Practitioners talked about how there's a complex and very cozy set of relationships between policymakers, owners, and INGOs in country, and it privileges those who know how to play the system and how to be in the same places as those donors and policymakers. And often that's because an expat staff member will join as a country director. They will then be invited to the ambassador's residence for drinks. They will then meet other funders. There'll be a cozy conversation, which then privileges access to funding. Calls for proposals then come out, and of course, those INGOs get access. And that is replicated time and time again across the world. And we've seen that, and that's been the way it's been working for decades. And then let me talk about fundraising, INGO fundraising. So INGO fundraising still is based on this, in a lot of cases, white gaze. The idea that we are looking at black and brown faces, and those are the sense that they lack agency and that we are here to help. We are here to civilize, develop, support, strengthen, whatever words we use. But actually, there's a set of assumptions about what capacity those organizations and those people have. And so there was a conversation about the white gaze of fundraising, and that we really need to start challenging our own assumptions around how we fundraise and what messages we are sending by doing that. Shannon, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dylan. So during the consultation on the third day, Dylan had the amazing idea to just give our participants some open space for them to share what they would like to see in a decolonized aid system. And so here are some quotes from some of our participants. We couldn't include all of them. People got really excited and were writing these lengthy manifestos. But to start with, our first participant says that we need to be willing to test out new methods of operation and engagement. We need to be willing to fail. And then, they invite us to their 5 main points, which is firstly an invitation to listen. Secondly, an invitation to act with humility. And I just want to take a moment to touch on that. A lot of what Dylan was talking about, which is knowledge generation, the white gaze of fundraising, the assumption that we have the answers, none of that is humble. All of that assumes that there's something fundamentally about those of us based in the West that is superior to those based in anywhere else. And so I think just really approaching systems and situations with humility, that allows us to be open. It allows us to be more inclusive and to be more accessible, both in our programs and in terms of, power structures, making accessing the heads of organizations, making that more accessible as well. And I think without humility, that fifth and final, and I would argue most important point, we are never going to be able to admit failure. Only once we acknowledge that we don't know everything, that we are trying things out, that we are in the process of co-creating, ideally, with people around the world, only then can we admit when we haven't done so well. Only then can we admit that in the past, we haven't necessarily had the successes we would have liked to see. And I think similarly, that idea of humility and knowledge creation, our second participant touches on it, talking about knowledge production and agency. And so to me, this calls us to consider Indigenous forms of knowledge. I love to use this example. I was having a conversation with an Indigenous woman from the Philippines, and she was sharing how in her community, in their language, peace is not a noun, but rather peace is a verb. Sorry, peace is not a verb, but peace building isn't a word, but rather peace in and of itself is a verb. And so if peace is already a verb, then there's no such thing as peace building. There's no such, it's in the word. You immediately understand that it's an ongoing, continual process. And so how does that then change how you engage with that community who has been affected by conflict? It fundamentally changes the way that you're going to engage with them, the way that you would develop a program. But without that understanding, without that valuing of Indigenous ways of thinking, we are missing something. And I think we miss a lot to our own detriment. And our third participant brought up something that I wanted to touch on that came up during the consultation, which was that some people were arguing that the aid flows as they currently exist, largely from the global north to the global south, are a form of reparations, and that they should be considered as such. And I think part of the allure of that framing is so often when we talk about aid, we view the recipients as passive, and even using terms such as beneficiaries, there is this idea and understanding that they are just receiving without contributing anything. And this person really challenges us to consider, well, why is there a need for that aid in the first place? And why is it that those relationships exist between regions that were formerly colonized and regions that were formerly colonizers? And so I think truly, to me, that consideration of aids as reparation is compelling. However, I would argue that without any sort of public and clear statement of aid flows as a form of reparations, no country can claim to have addressed their colonial past. And I think that as well is a challenge, because clearly there are harms that are ongoing that we have yet to address. So that brings us to our recommendations. And so we separated our recommendations for donors, INGOs, policymakers. Then we have recommendations specifically for INGOs, and then recommendations specifically for individuals. And so first and foremost, we need to begin by acknowledging that structural racism exists and that it exists within our system. Without that acknowledgement, everything else will not be able to happen. We will continue to blind ourselves to the harm that we have done and are continuing to do. And I think it can be really difficult to do that, to take that first step, simply because so many of us enter the system because we believe in the work and we genuinely want to make the world better. And that's where we have to relinquish our egos and, to return back to what our first participant invited us to do. We have to be humble and say, okay, well, we're not living up to our values. How can we go from there? And so that acknowledgement hopefully will underpin everything that we do moving forward. And so from that creates a necessity to then encourage conversations with partners and grantees and communities about power and seeing how we wield it and how they perceive us. Because if we acknowledge structural racism, then we need to acknowledge these unequal dynamics that have developed as a consequence. We need to acknowledge and create spaces for local groups to strategize together without us, without anyone from outside of their communities, allowing them to develop their own sense of process without relying on Western forms of doing things. I think we also need to be willing to reassess the language that we're using. Dylan touched on some words that really were poorly received during the consultation, such as capacity building or lacking capacity, such as aid, such as beneficiaries. And we need to be willing to change our language and respect and respond to the requests of our partners all around the world. I think, and that part of that is also being willing and able to receive criticism. So often, because of the power structures of the system, there have been very few avenues for people that we are engaging with to actually critique us. And we may say, well, we have feedback sessions, we do create opportunities for people to comment. Do people feel like they are risking funding if they were to criticize you? That is not a free and open access to critique. If people are concerned about the ability to continue doing their work, their ability to continue, depending on what they're doing, to continue saving lives and keeping their communities healthy, that is not an avenue for open critique. So we need to really challenge ourselves to be bolder in what we're imagining with our communities, and say, well, there are no consequences. Say how you feel, so we can really begin addressing some of the ways that we haven't been doing what we aim to do. And I think as well, we need to fund local groups more courageously. We need to trust them. We need to remove the tedious and onerous due diligence and compliance processes that we have seen during COVID-19, during the pandemic. A number of organizations have removed a lot of those processes and requirements when it came to funding, or have simplified them in various ways. So we know that it's possible. We know that we can have accountability. We know that we can have transparency in our relationships without all of this paperwork. So why have we been so reluctant for so long to make the necessary changes? And, to Dylan's point, a lot of that is rooted in overt and structural racist beliefs. And part of that is going to require us to recruit differently. Who is at the table, not only in terms of who's writing your reports, or who's representing you when you have anything public facing to do, but what does your management look like? What does your board look like? And when we're talking about decolonizing, we don't only mean talking about race and ethnicity. We also mean, have you created access for young parents? Because if they have young children, many people aren't able to engage in the system the way that they would like to. Or have we created access for people who, have disabilities? There are many, many things to consider. And when we're recruiting differently, we need to shift our idea of what qualified means. That isn't to say that we shouldn't have people who are good at their jobs, but it is to say that a lot of the things that we point to say, oh, this person will be qualified, we are missing a lot of very valuable skills. And simply looking at their degree, simply looking at who they know, simply looking at their last held position with no consideration for their backgrounds, their experience, their personality, their emotional intelligence, these are all vital as well. And then I think as well, investing in Indigenous knowledge creation. I touched on this earlier, and I just feel incredibly strongly about it. During COVID, we saw research continued, and people weren't able to travel in the ways that they have in the past. And research continued, and those of us in the global north, we were able to learn and benefit from research conducted and led by those in the global south. So how can we normalize that and create and build that into our systems a lot more without the need for a pandemic? So for our INGOs, and I think the reason we have separate recommendations is INGOs have very particular relationships with people who are based in their own communities. So firstly, we need to end the process of white gaze fundraising. We need to stop simply choosing images of random Black, brown, and people of color and putting them on our websites and saying, well, this is indicative of the fact that we work in community. It is insulting. And I think we need to think about why those images are effective. What are the underlying assumptions that we're drawing on when we use an image of, a small Black child who's starving? We are building on decades, generations of beliefs that Black people are largely incapable of helping themselves or saving themselves, if you want to use that language. Using a child, would we use children without parental consent if they were from the United States? We wouldn't. And so how do we really respect the agency and full humanity of our colleagues all over the world? And I think white gaze fundraising is a key element of that, and really considering what it means when we use images and what are we trying to say. Secondly, we need to adopt a transition mindset. So especially for country offices, I think we forget that ideally our jobs should no longer exist. I think Dylan and I especially, we work in peace building. The fact that we have jobs means that people are living in conflict. I know that I would love to not have a job in 10 years. I would love to have to train in an entirely different field because either conflict has been resolved all around the world, that's a dream, or people have the ability to respond to conflict, and not just the ability, but they have the access. They can access the necessary funds, they can access the necessary governments and UN officials and whomever it may be. I would like to no longer be necessary. And so really, how can we build in this transition mindset, really knowing that those most proximate and most affected by whatever situation, almost without exception, are going to be best suited to responding. And country offices actively work in the face of this knowledge that we have. So we need to start closing those down, honestly, as much as possible, and just entrusting finances, decision-making, research over to those who are already present and already doing this work. I think as well, since 2016, after the Grand Bargain Agreement, we've been talking a lot about localization. Localization has served as a coverall for some of the other challenges and issues that are facing our system and our sector. We need to talk about racism. There are reasons why we are so reluctant to give grant funding, large sums of funding, to people in certain parts of the world. And it isn't only because we're worried about absorption capacity. It's also because we have these beliefs about people, about corruption, about the inherent riskiness of certain communities over others. And I think localization has allowed us to not engage with some of those underlying beliefs that are really damaging and really limiting the effectiveness and sustainability of our efforts. And for it, I think we need to reevaluate our partnerships. And this comes back to what we said earlier. We need that criticism, and we need to be creative when we're building these relationships. What does a horizontal partnership look like? How can we recognize that it is not them receiving from us, but we are also receiving something? It is a reciprocal relationship. We learn and we gain from entering into these partnerships. And so how can we truly view them as partnerships and not simply extractive relationships where those in the global south are passively benefiting? Because that simply isn't true. I see I'm mindful of the time, so I'm just going to go very quickly through our recommendations for individuals. We need to reflect on our impositionality. None of us enter this space neutrally. I myself, I'm a woman, I'm Black. The way that people engage with me is very different than if I held different identities. I'm also American. That changes the way that people engage with me. It's important to be mindful of this, because I think for too long we have assumed that as long as we are not from that context, we are fundamentally neutral, and that isn't true. And so we need to ask ourselves some difficult questions. How have we benefited from existing structures of racism and discrimination? And we have all benefited. I know that I have benefited, and so the reason we're invited today in part is because the report was written in English. If it had been written in Swahili, we probably wouldn't have been invited to speak with you today. So there are different elements like this that we need to consider. That is, a form of discrimination, and we need to be intentional about addressing it in our own system. What efforts have you been involved in with your own community? So I think too often we look overseas, we look far away, we say there's conflict, there's challenge, there's development that's needed there. I live in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. experiences a huge amount of gun violence, of just general poverty. What are we doing in Washington, D.C.? And that's something that the U.S. Office of Peace Direct is talking about. We're trying to develop a program so that not only are we doing peace building overseas, but that we're in community with our neighbors, and that we really do see there is conflict right here at home that we can also be effective in addressing. How have you inadvertently reinforced structural racism? That's a hard one. That's going to require you to I think, remove ego, require all of us to just take a breath, allow the discomfort to pass over us, and then continue moving forward. Again, remain humble. You need to sit with yourself and think, how will I respond to criticism? Because you will be critiqued and you will get things wrong, and that's okay. But how will you respond? Will it be defensive? Will it be dismissive? Because immediately once you've done that, any relationship that you've built, the trust has been broken. Any progress that you've made in decolonizing, you've set yourself back. And then again, part of humility is admitting that we don't know everything, we don't understand everything. So let's remain open to new forms of thinking and knowledge. And this is where it comes back to trusting Indigenous thinkers, academics, practitioners, and researchers who can really lead us into what it looks like for their own community and how best to do research within that community. Shift access and power. What makes you the best person to address an issue? I would invite people to say no. If you think that there are others who are better suited, pass the mic. And I think this last point is really challenging, but I would invite you to turn down opportunities if the values that you hold are not being represented. I know this is an incredibly difficult set of recommendations that I'm making, but I think it can start very, very small. I think it can start internally. Are you the best person to speak on this project in your organization, or do you have a colleague who's maybe more junior, or who might be better suited? What would it look like for you to pass the mic to them? And then on a larger scale, if you are entering a relationship with a funder and the funding relationship has all of these hoops that you have to jump through and all of this paperwork and all of these things that you feel are fundamentally against your own values, what would it look like for you to bring that to them and say, I would love to enter into this relationship with you, but these are our values and these are where there's a disconnect. What would it look like to have those conversations? This is not going to happen overnight, and so I don't expect people to just turn things down left, right, and center, but I think slowly, if we can hold ourselves to a higher standard individually and within our organizations, we can start to do it within the sector as well. Thank you. And I know that Dylan and I are keen to have a conversation, and so I don't know, John, if you have a preferred way that you normally manage questions.
Yes, well, if people have a raise hand button, then click on that button, because we now have way more than one screen full of people. So who has a question that they'd like to ask? And if so, raise your hand and unmute yourself. And oh, let's see, I think there's one. Yes, Rollins, please.
Thank you very much, John, and our colleagues from Peace Direct. This is really, really exciting and thought-provoking and beautiful, beautiful presentation. I think you got it. That's the way to go. And I have a comment, and really this comment is not directly, specifically for Peace Direct, but I think it's for all of us. I have this comment because the issue, I think, for me is how do we ensure that this topic does not become another overplayed sexy song? I say this because I see more and more individual players on this topic. I don't know how many presentations I've attended, papers I'm reading about decolonizing aid and all that. They seem to be coming up every day. And much as that is exciting, the question to us should be, how do we move into a global one voice movement on decolonizing aid to an extent that it becomes so powerful and it makes those that feed on this evil uncomfortable? Because right now, that team is well structured and comfortable. It worries me because we are losing the COVID-19 window of opportunity. We have never had in our history the best example which placed and humbled all of us and placed the right people in their right place. We saw INGOs withdrawing, experts withdrawing for safety. And we saw true leaders, the unsung heroes, showing up and these are the community leaders. But now we are seeing more and more of the same, as you rightly put it. INGOs are even having workshops on re-entry strategies, even sharing re-entry strategies. How do we re-enter? Because we withdrew from the area, all right? And so the same structure is building up again. And the universe is watching us. So how do we build that global undeniable movement so we stop working as individuals? Otherwise, I think it will become a song. They'll just be watching us and all that, and then it will come back to the same thing again. Can we do something to harness this window that COVID-19 presented to all of us? That's really my cry. Thank you.
Dylan, you have a...
Yeah, thanks, John. And Roland, thank you so much for that brilliant statement. I'd like to respond by saying a couple of things. First, I think we have lost our window of opportunity with COVID. I think that the way I describe it is that the gravitational pull of the sector is so great that it is just pulling us all back to that status quo. And so any optimism that I had, or the activists that I know had around this being an opportunity to see a shift in the system is not, I doubt is going to happen. I think that there are other points, opportunities, leverage points, and I think you're right that there are more conversations now around decolonizing than we've ever seen before. That is both an opportunity and a risk. I think in terms of a risk, we've seen what happened with localization, as Shannon mentioned. Localization became a buzz term, a buzzword. I mean, anything but a really genuine shift in power. I even heard, the head of the EU's humanitarian funding talked about an INGO being registered locally as being a fantastic example of localization. And there was a whole huge response from the sector saying, "Are you crazy? This is, that's not localization." So I think we've seen these fads come and go, and I think there's a very real risk that the decolonizing conversation becomes another fashion. Everyone talks about it, they nod, they do a little bit of self-reflection and then move on and then just continue. So we're trying to figure out how to deepen the conversation, maintain the momentum. And it's not just about Peace Direct, it's about other organizations doing that as well. So we've committed another 18 months of work to just really talk to organizations about how they might be able to do some of this. But you're absolutely right, Roland. I don't know how this becomes much more of a global movement unless we all, as Shannon talked about in her recommendations, all embrace recommendations starting with ourselves. So if we start from our own place, then the organizations that we work with and in, maybe then we'll start to see that shift, and it shifts then from just a rhetoric to actual reality. And I think that there's a chance of that, because we just need, the way I described it recently was the decolonizing conversation has been a whisper for years. And now it's becoming, how do we turn it into a shout? How do we turn it into a chorus? And actually, I think it is becoming that. And once it's that, I think it's going to be very, very difficult for policymakers to, and others to ignore. But it will require consistent attention. This is not just a thing that we talk about and then we move on. So it's going to take time, and it's going to take organizational commitment. So, for the 63 people on this call, I hope that there are ways in which this, you all can do some in your own organizations, because that will be a huge contribution to keeping that momentum going.
Can I just add something to what you were saying, Dylan? I think it is a chorus, and I think one thing that I do want to leave you with is people care. So I have been having conversations with everybody from, the US government to really large INGOs, and watching the people who care at various levels, including incredibly high up, there is an appetite for this. There is an acknowledgement that, I really do believe that people are in this work because they want to make the world better. And I think, as awful as it sounds, if we could capitalize on that, and if we could press that initial reason why people entered this field, not everybody, but many, and say, without acknowledging structural racism, without deconstructing the system as we have built it, we are only perpetuating certain harms. We are only serving as another factor, another avenue that's causing challenges. And I think that, more than anything, at an interpersonal level, is going to keep a lot of people committed to this conversation. And I think the real challenge then comes, and Dylan brought it up, how do we get individual people to feel comfortable and to feel empowered bringing it up within their organizations as well? But I think remembering that it isn't just you, it isn't just me, it isn't just Dylan, but that there is a growing community of people who are committed to this is really helpful. And there are different organizations. I just want to shout out one of our partner organizations on this project, on this report, Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security. They're having these conversations. They exist to have conversations about race and gender and intersectionality in this space. And so there are people doing it. There are communities. I would invite you to find them and to allow them to help strengthen you as you then move forward and say, I thought as an organization, we said we cared about this. We haven't talked about it in months. We haven't done anything on this in months. So that it's not easy, but I think it is. We are not one, we are many.
Thank you. Who else has, I don't see any other hands at the moment. Does anyone else have a question they want to raise?
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Please.
Yeah, so now, this conversation about decolonizing aid comes at a very interesting time. There has been a general conversation about the reduction in aid numbers overall. And if you looked recently, there has been instances where some donors, previously they had committed 0.7% of their GDP for aid. And after, whatever has transpired in Europe and some other, the right wing coming, the popularization of the right wing, politics and all that, you find that some governments are now asking whether they should actually spend that money for domestic issues, while initially the intention was to use that money for global aid and stuff like that. So now the question is, with all these overall, aid numbers going down, and then, of course, people having the discussion about decolonizing aid and localization and all this, don't you think it may be a situation where now that aid money is going down, then it makes sense to localize? But suppose the aid money now later on gets back up, will there be another discussion now to internationalize aid again? Because, I've had conversations locally with my colleagues in, Asia and Africa sometimes. And we always ask, is this just because of the general realization that aid money overall is going down and therefore we need to localize? But when the money comes back up and, there's increased funding, then we'll start seeing again a reversal of the whole process. Thank you. It's just an observation. It may be, it's not necessarily a question per se.
Thank you, Wycliffe. Any response, Dylan or Shannon?
Yeah, I'm happy to have a quick response to that. I think, Wycliffe, you're right that there is an opportunity here, I think, when the aid spending has dropped, to be able to explain to people, and I think we should be explaining to people, that this move is important both sort of morally, ethically, as well as providing better outcomes for communities. So this isn't just, this is of course about tackling structural racism, colonizing our sector. And by doing that, we will be a more effective sector. Therefore, that money that is spent will be better spent, will be more sustainable. The effects will be more sustainable. So even those who aren't yet persuaded, I think there's an effectiveness argument around it as well. Our sector will be improved and the outcomes for communities will be improved as well. But you do make a very important point that the funding may increase, and as funding increases, donors feel pressure to get the money out of the door. Donors then give it, $100, $200, $500 million grants to big commercial entities or large NGOs, and actually we're back to where we were at the beginning. So those are real risks. We have to take it one step at a time. Let's make this conversation, as Shannon said, let's make this conversation as loud and as vocal as possible. And hopefully, if we can get enough traction, and we are trying to engage with governments around this, and actually, if the funding does increase at some point, at that point, there'll be hopefully a window of opportunity to think differently about how that money is spent, rather than shifting back into the old approaches. No guarantee of that. The next phase in the work that we need to do is really engage with governments on this to make sure that this embedded. I mean, some people have said, who are the rule setters in the system? Actually, NGOs get a lot of their funding from governments, and governments and government funding represents such a gigantic percentage of a lot of NGO income. So we need to engage them on different ways that they see the world, and they actually disperse funding as well.
Great, Dylan, thank you. Celine, you have the last hand up and the last comment or question.
Thank you, John. This is the first time I'm joining actually the conversation. I'm a believer in community-led development, and listening to Dylan and Shannon is like, oh, people will go to the street the next minute. Oh, I'm a peace builder. I was preparing to respond, but I'm calling from Eldoret, out of Nairobi, but Kenya. Now, I have already actually done some comment, but I think as a peace builder, I want to bring this perspective. It's very important to appreciate the origin of AIDS and ask ourselves why the AIDS in the first place. And I think for me, in the context of Kenya, when the AIDS, international development aid began in the face of the governments that were actually looting from the nations. So when you are thinking about, when we're talking about, we are perceived as corrupt, people can really practice fraud, then we need to really understand that history. And when history has informed perception, it becomes a big challenge. We remember, so the AIDS began in the wake of corruption, in the wake of poor leadership, political intimidation and manipulation, education. You hardly got a class. Some of us actually never studied inside a class. We studied under trees and on stones, but we had governments all the same. So I think it's very important that we look at that. And appreciate the history that brought things, and then of course appreciating the diversity. Now, development agencies has already been mentioned. The INGO gets their money from the government, their governments, and definitely these governments have an agenda. So the importance of keeping an eye on the agenda, leave alone the money, keeping an eye on the agenda and directing it is something that definitely is under carpet. Most aid, of course, are anchored on the foreign policies. So I think these are the things that I've lived to understand for the years I've worked anyway with NGOs and INGO. And so the foreign policies direct a lot on how and who is the custodian of foreign policy. They are men, they are women. So that's why you will always find that happening. But I really appreciate this because it is pushing for recognition of the primacy of local actors. And when pushing on this primacy of local actors, how can we distinguish between the systems and individuals' behavior? Because I've also experienced that sometimes it's not just about the system of the INGO or the foreign governments. It is individuals carrying all their baggage of bad behavior and do all this discrimination and bring the racism and all that. So I think it's important that as we push for this agenda, we really think of how we distinguish between the systems. And because if we talk about the system, that means we have to go to the policy and find out if the policy is really talking about all the things that we're talking about. Then the role of national governments, our governments, in creating balance, of course, and building relationships that mutually benefit both international development agencies and local actors. I think it's very important. In Kenya, what I see happening right now is that the Kenyan government has come up with a policy on recruitment. When it comes to key personnel, they want to be sure that no one actually locally has the capacity to do that. And they have to really justify that. But if at all there isn't, then within the design of a program, there has to be there has to be kind of a clause that will define how you're going, a national will be mentored into the job, maybe 2 years or 1.5 years, 1 year after, so that if we have an international, the experts they call many times, then we have a local, local who has to be mentored to take over the job. So I think the role of our national government is very, very important. Power relations, as I finish. What facilitates the power relations? I think that's really it. And you can imagine you have the money, they have the money, you don't have the money. I have the money, you don't have the money. And you know, money changes things. So how do we also, you know, as nationals, as developing countries, really, really build a culture of accountability and a culture of transparency that we can actually build our own wealth so that we don't keep on depending on aids, development aids, so much so that we are dictated to their terms. You see, that's the thing. When we are being put even by our own governments to be like paupers and beggars, then you go to beg, and in every house you beg, there are rules. So I think it is very important that as we look at this, we look at it more broadly, and we bring into what can we appreciate, what can we not appreciate, so that we are our push is also mutually beneficial to all. Thank you.
Thank you, Celine. I think you've capstoned this conversation brilliantly. You know, if we're talking about shifting the power, we really are talking about shifting the money. And I loved the comments in this report on really shifting our thinking about the money from aid to reparations, which is so often exactly the case. Okay, thank you, Dylan and Shannon. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll send the link to the full report out to everyone. And we'll be also looking forward to the release of the updated Local First book. And really, I appreciate the thinking, thought, and clarity that went into this presentation. It was really perfect. Thank you. We're now going to jump back into the rest of our program. So all of us who have bits of this program, we're going to need to be pithy in getting it across. Let me just throw up the slide again. So where, Chrome tab. Okay, there we go. So as I mentioned, and as you saw in the chat from Sai, our colleague, we are in the process of kind of building a triple nexus working group to look at some of these issues, because the triple nexus does embrace some of these issues of humanitarian development and peace. We are one of the issues, you know, that particularly humanitarian peace building, and all three of these pieces of the nexus have been highly top down, and yet, as mentioned by Dylan and Shannon, there are local peace builders there are local development actors, there's local humanitarian responders, and ideally that's where all of this has to happen, is in communities. How can we support the access of these local actors and support the local leadership in communities to really have the access they need to succeed in these functions? So we're putting together a working group and looking for leadership of that. Please visit that page on our website. I've also been having individual conversations with some of the leaders of organizations working on this. So feel free to contact me about this, and hopefully we'll get this working group off the ground. Then I want to jump to some updates from around the world. Steve, this is a picture of Steve, who many of you have met. He's our coordinator right now, working with chapter in Kenya. They met with the governor recently. Steve, are you on the line? Are you on the call?
Yes,
are you able to?
I'm on the line, John.
Tell us how that meeting went.
Oh, it went on really great. We were basically having a discussion on how best we can collaborate with the Kisumu County. This is the governor of the Kisumu County government here in Kenya. It's called Professor Peter Nyang'o. And Kisumu is one of the counties that, you know, are really doing well in terms of devolution and empowering people at the grassroots level using the devolved system. And so he was really interested to learn about what we are doing. And he actually mentioned that there are some key events coming up in Kisumu. There's a regional green city event that brings together African cities to discuss various issues around development. There is also another investment forum that's coming up that he committed to give us slots to basically present about what we are doing and that. And you know, we'll be meeting with the minister for cooperatives in his county next week to just discuss the details on how best we can move this collaboration forward.
Wonderful, Steve. Thank you so much. And we'll those dates and events we'll include in the newsletter that will be going out from this call tonight. What other national chapters have updates that they'd like to share with everyone? Anyone?
Hi, John. This is Diana from Mexico.
Hey, Diana.
Just a quick update. We're still working on these proposals on 12 commitments towards local development, and we're starting working with new local authorities, and also creating like clusters with different organizations for putting out this agenda and change. And to give insights for the development and local development plans that are going to be created over the next month. So that's kind of our focus right now.
Oh, great. So yeah, I saw the event that you're putting together. So any materials you have on that, we'll get them up on the MCLD/Mexico webpage soon.
Yeah, thank you. And also another quick announce is that we're going to have our independent dialogue on the Food Systems Summit. It's going to be next Tuesday. It's going to be in Spanish, sorry for that, but we're working on reimagining local systems. So we're working with different organizations, and we want to really put the focus on local food systems and the participation of communities in producing our foods. And yeah, that's going to be next Tuesday.
Wonderful, Diana, thank you. Any other chapter updates before we jump to the research updates? Yeah, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Dr. John, this is Jude Wachuku from Liberia.
Yeah, you're loud and clear, Jude. Great to hear you.
Okay, thank you very much. I just want to give a quick update on what we are doing here presently in Liberia. As we likely know, our chapter had been granted a certificate by the Liberian government to operate in Liberia. So right now we have finally got the certificate, and we have been given the legal order to operate in Liberia after many months of trying to get the certificate done. So that is a quick update I just want to give in regards to that. And this week, Madam Anne and Mr. Pascal also had a meeting with us in regards to our agricultural workshop, which went up very well. So I just want to congratulate them, Madam Anne and Mr. Pascal, for having that meeting with us this week. Thank you.
Wonderful. Great to hear. Thank you.
I can follow on to that and just congratulate Jude and the Liberia chapter for negotiating complex bureaucracies in order to register their organization. Congratulations, and also their concept that they're developing to support better, sustainable, nutritious local food systems in Liberia is truly revolutionary. So, and making great progress. Also, I don't think we have anyone from the Sierra Leone chapter, budding Sierra Leone chapter on the call. So I'll just say that we had a call this week, and that chapter has gathered some new interested members, and there's a lot of enthusiasm about the value add that chapter can offer in Sierra Leone, where domestic civil society organizations really don't have good places to come together and collaborate, but instead are often pitted against each other as they apply for the same grants instead. Yes. So looking forward to more and better progress from Sierra Leone as well. And I think that Pascal is not on the call, but let's just say that one time we need to have a whole meeting just about the Benin chapter. I know Bérenger is here. They're still doing incredible things in a lot of different arenas. So I will leave that at that.
Oh, very good. Thanks, Anne. So Gunjan, you want to give us an update on on research?
Yes, but before I do that, John, I think Kate had her hand up, and she's with one of the partners who's been working on the Sierra Leone chapter, I think, with Anne and others. So, Kate, I don't know if you had something that you wanted to say.
Kate?
I was just gonna jump on Anne's enthusiasm for starting conversations.
And if you could talk a little louder, Kate, that would be great.
From local groups and CBOs and oh yeah. Oh. Okay. Let me try taking that out.
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay. I was just going to jump on Anne's enthusiasm here for out here in Sierra Leone with starting conversations with some CBOs and local groups about establishing a chapter here and making use of the community-led assessment tool with some other groups out here. So hopefully more exciting developments to come.
Great. Great. Thanks, Kate. Gunjan?
Yes, thank you, Kate. And speaking of the community-led assessment tool, I also want to acknowledge that One Village Partners was actually the first organization that had used this tool on their programming. And thank you, Kate, and your team for actually, setting the example for all of us and doing that testing and using it on your programming. Since as many of you know, in January this year, we launched just two tools, the CLD assessment tool and then an evaluation tool specifically. And the progress has been phenomenal. The uptake has been way more than I think all of us who were part of this collaborative process of developing the tools over 2 years. I think it has been way more than any of us had expected. We've seen many organizations and agencies not just be downloading the tool, but coming back to us, asking for trainings around it. So it's been phenomenal. We have been presenting, different members of the team have been presenting at different fora, from the Community-Based Adaptations Conference that happened in June to presenting at the Tamarack Institute webinar yesterday. So we have a lot going on. There's been a lot of interest in really doing trainings on how do we effectively use the CLD assessment tool so that it just doesn't become one more checklist that we are ticking against. It just doesn't become another way of skirting some important issues in the work that we do, but it actually becomes a way for us to address all of these issues of inclusion, participation, voice, agency. How are we doing it? Who is at the table? Who is not at the table? Who else needs to be at the table, and not just be at the table, but be leading the discussion, right? All of these questions, how do we ensure that we are answering them by using this tool? So because of all of that and the demand, we created a 4-hour training module. We already did our first training in Malawi, and it has been what we're really trying to do is to actually make sure that it is the chapter members who are themselves doing these trainings, who are leading these trainings then, because we recognize that they really are the custodians of this work, right? So the next training is going to happen. It's a bilingual training. So again, I know Dylan and Marianne, not Marianne, sorry, Dylan and Shannon spoke to this point about language. And we recognize how language can be a huge barrier. And so what we have been doing is we are trying to see how do we improve access to the extent that we can. We now, I'm very happy to say, and a huge shout out to Deanna and members from Outreach International, as well as Martha from our team, who made sure that we now have a Spanish version of the tool. So the CLD assessment tool, both on the web version as well as the Excel version, is available in Spanish now. We are holding our first bilingual training in English and French tomorrow. So July 1st and 2nd, the Bene chapter is going to be holding the training. I see Beranje on the call. He, as well as other members from the chapter, will be facilitating and leading the simulation on the tool. We will have another training for the Bene chapter in, again, bilingual training, just because the demand has been so phenomenal towards the end of July. We are organizing a special 90-minute training on the tool for the Tamarack Institute and their attendees again in July. So we have a lot going on the tool. You see here the picture from the Malawi training. I see my colleague Nelly, who was part of the team developing the tool, is on the call. She's also been one of our trainers. Eileen is not on the call. She's also been there. So I just want to acknowledge everyone who's been part of the process. I want to encourage anybody who is rolling out this tool or is using the tool to please get in touch with us and let us know your experience of it. We want to understand how do we simplify and make this better. We already have a group that is working on how do we make this tool usable with community members. So we remove all the development jargon and completely simplify it in the language of the community. I see Khyber here, who is part of that group. So I just want to acknowledge all the people from all over who've been part of this. The final thing I want to say is on the overall research. Alongside this tool, we've had other segments of the research going on. We have a realist synthesis going on right now, where we're looking very specifically at how facilitation and community leadership lead to improvements in equity and resilience, and also lead to greater food security. This part of, as you all know, the first part of our research and everything that we did for the last 2 years was completely pro bono. There was no funding from anybody. It was all your efforts and enthusiasm that got us to where we are. We did get funding to get guidance on realist methods from IDEAL, which is a USAID supported activity, for the second part of the realist work that we are doing, and the results will be out in August. So look out in August for invitations, where we will share for the first time. The research team is now looking at impact. So we will share that segment of our work in August and September in events which are both in English and French. So we're going to have dedicated events in French as well to reach out to as many people as possible. The final thing I want to say on the tools and the training and all of this is that I know a lot of organizations are planning to use them in different countries where they do their work, which means that you will be translating the tool into languages in those countries. I've heard of people trying to talk about translating it into Hindi and Swahili and other languages. If you are doing that, please do share the versions that you create with us so that we can make them accessible to more and more people. We don't have the capacity to do translations into all local languages, but we want to make it as accessible as possible. So that's all on the tool and training front. John, you want me to talk about the sector dialogues now? Or?
Yes.
The last thing I want to say is that these conversations around, decolonizing aid, about community-led development, need to happen broadly as it's happening in the, with us, but they also need to happen with sector experts. One of the things we have realized is that we go through these long processes of convincing and trying to convince funders and agencies and governments about the need for, community-led development. And as they begin to listen to us, as they begin to take steps towards this end, they go to the sector experts who are part of their committees, and then they hear conflicting views. So we really want to, make sure that the conversations around CLD are happening within each of the sectors itself. And so as a first step, we have a wonderful group of summer interns who have taken on the challenge and the responsibility of convening sector dialogues with support from our colleague, Sarah Bulbul. Throughout July and August, we will be holding a series of sector dialogue on health, WASH, livelihoods, climate, education, and access to justice. These are the first 6 dialogues that we have planned. We would request you, if you or your colleagues are, part of discussions with different agencies, if this is your area of interest and expertise, then please let us know so that we can include you in the relevant dialogues. These will be smaller conversations, but intense conversations to see how do we center CLD in the work that we do in this sector, and how do we speak to agencies and funders to do that. So I would request all of you to connect us with anybody who we should be talking to for these sector dialogues. I'm going to end there. Sorry that.
Great. No, thanks so much, Gunjan. So the getting, this kind of outreach and transformative work does take us reaching out to people. And I particularly appreciated the comment by Dylan and Shannon about passing the mic. I know one of the opportunities during COVID is that, I mean, personally, I've been able to demand of USAID and other Western-based dialogues that, since they're being done on Zoom anyway, let's have the voices from Africa, South Asia, Latin America in those meetings, sharing what they see that needs to happen. There's several of those that are coming up. I just want to share, this is a bit of a massive list, but for the rest of this year, there are an enormous number of international fora that our voices can be brought to. I know Deanna already mentioned it. There are side events happening around the Food Systems Summit, around the UN High-Level Political Forum. These will go straight on through the end of this year, and we'll, on our website and in our newsletters, we're going to be constantly looking for opportunities to make sure that the voice of community leaders is at the table. Let me go to the next page. Learning how to jump back and forth here. Okay, so there are a few events that are coming right up. There's one on the 6th that the Hunger Project is hosting on bridging the digital divide, really having digital technology in the hands of small-scale rural farmers. There'll be a link in the newsletter for anyone wanting to register for that. The UN is having, I just got this today, they're on the 8th, they're having this event called Building Back Fairer, Equality in a Post-COVID World. That's going to be a challenge, so there'll be a link to that. And then our sister network, the Global Fund for Community Foundations, is having their big event on the 14th. And that will also be at a time that should work for everybody to join. I'll include a link to that in the newsletter that goes out. And the Global Fund for Community Foundations, because it does shift the money, and this is a point that was made earlier, is a really valuable place for people to participate. Our next global call is scheduled for the 28th of July. And I want us to have a short conversation in our last few minutes on what time of day should it be. So we have a time of day, 10 a.m., which works across the Western Hemisphere, but doesn't work at all for people in East Asia. During COVID, a lot of us have gotten used to having 7 and 8 a.m. calls. So to me, it doesn't seem like a terrible thing to shift our global call back 2 hours if it would allow greater participation from Asia. But I did want to not just do that without hearing from you. So let me stop sharing and go back and just hear, does anyone have a comment on the pros and cons of shifting our monthly global call to be 2 hours earlier? Anyone? You can just unmute and shout it out if you do have an opinion on this matter. I also wrote specifically to all the Asians in our mailing list earlier today to get their feedback on it, because we had been trying to have separate Asia calls. There's just so much value, I think, in all being together if we can. So anyone have any thoughts on this?
This is Andrea Reed Davis from Outreach. We're pretty used to using that timeline for working with our partners in Asia. So very supportive of that if it will allow more to be able to be a part of these important conversations.
And you're out west, right?
Yeah, we're actually in Kansas City, actually.
Oh, in Kansas City. Okay, so you're 1 hour back. Okay, same as Deanna.
Yeah.
And Deanna, you're the one who would be most stressed. This could work for you doing this 2 hours earlier.
Yeah, it would be a little bit hard, but no, it's okay because we have the chance to have all these voices and even more perspective. So it's fine for us, at least from the team of THP Mexico. I think that will work.
Okay, great. Okay, well, we're almost at the end. Does anyone have any last words that they want to get in before we close today's call? Okay.
Kudos to everyone. These are such wonderful, important topics that MCLD continues to bring to the forum for all of us to participate in, and just want to share my gratitude for that. So thank you.
John.
Thank you.
John.
Yes.
I'm Marian from Uganda.
Yes, I'm Marian.
I'm good. I just had a comment. I would like maybe in the upcoming calls, if you can have a discussion on the issue of science in Africa. We're being affected with having low vaccines now as the pandemic takes toll, especially in Uganda, because governments have to purchase vaccines in the West or in America. So it would be interesting to bring a topical discussion on the future of science for Africa, investments in science in Africa. Thank you.
Oh, that's a great suggestion, Marian. In fact, I just saw an announcement. There's a seminar this week on setting up a big vaccine, doing the transfer technology of these COVID vaccines to organizations in South Africa. So it's a timely conversation. And in fact, I think one of our very first Africa Prize winner was the founder of the African Academy of Sciences. So it's a timely issue and very critical. Okay, everybody. Well, thank you so much for being with us. As always, the recording of this will be up on our website as soon as Zoom finishes processing it. And I'll be sending out an email to everyone with the links. Thanks again, everybody, for joining today. It was a wonderful conversation. And thanks again to Peace Direct for all the work they did in the presentation they made today. So if everyone wants to unmute and say goodbye, it would be great to hear your voices.
Thank you, Dr.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Wow.
Thank you, Madam Anne. Thank you, Madam Anne. Hi, Dean.
Thank
you, Dr. Todd. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.